Okay, good evening ladies and gentlemen. With it being 7 o'clock, we'll make a start. A warm welcome to those attending and also to our viewers watching live on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon, London. This is a meeting of the Residents' Education and Environmental Services Policy Overview Committee. My name is Councillor Wayne Bridges and I'm the chairman of this meeting. The key role of this committee is to monitor the performance of local public services within its remit and to hold in-depth reviews on topics of resident interest. We engage with a range of external witnesses in our activity, which can include community groups, residents and subject matter experts. Where we identify areas for change or improvement, we make recommendations to the decision-making cabinet. Details of the business to be considered today is shown on the agenda, copies of which are available in the room and also accessible on YouTube underneath the broadcast. For those present in the room and intended to speak, please note that you will be filmed and any statements you make will be recorded and made public. And for those in the public gallery, you will not be on camera. A reminder to councillors, officers and those speaking today that you should turn your microphone button on when speaking. This will ensure that you can be heard in the room and by those watching online. And going around the table this evening, allow me to introduce the people present. To my right is Councillor Markham, the Vice Chairman, Councillor Kaufman, Councillor Rodriguez, Councillor McWarner, Councillor Tuckwell. To my left, Neil Fraser, Democratic Services Officer, Councillor Eggington, Councillor Dillon, Mr Little, and our officers, Kathy, Dan and Vikram, Chris, and our witness this evening, Rose. Before we get started to the main agenda, some quick housekeeping rules. We're not expecting a fire alarm this evening. If one does sound, please follow officers to the fire exits and out of the building to the designated meeting point, which is the Civic Forecourt. Mobile devices to be switched off or placed on silent, and if we have residents here this evening, feedback forms are available through the clerk. Before I go on to item 1, for the benefit of those substituting this evening, the way we conduct this meeting is that we allow the witnesses and officers to give their presentations. That is then followed by questions by members who will indicate to me accordingly. You will be allowed one question followed by a supplementary. That way we go around the table in an orderly fashion. After everyone has had a say, we can then go back to questions from other members who wish to ask more than one question. With that said, we go to apologies for absence, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies from receiving Councillor Sweeting and Mathers, with Councillors Edgerton and Dillon present as the substitutes.
Thank you very much, and a warm welcome to Councillor Eggington and Councillor Dillon substituting this evening. Any declaration of interest in matters coming before this meeting? No. I can confirm that all business this evening will be discussed in part 1, and that brings us on to item 4 to agree the minutes of the previous meeting. I believe the clerk wishes to make some comments. Are there any questions before I go on to him? No. Mr Fraser.
Thank you, Chairman. So, members will recall that Councillor Sweeting mentioned at the last meeting that a number of outstanding actions remained outstanding from previous meetings. Members will have seen a variety of emails from myself over the last few weeks, and I can say now that most of the actions from previous meetings have now been resolved. There are a couple of outstandings, and I'm just going to give a brief overview of those now. So, the emergency response item heard at the 18th of July meeting, the action was to share details of major incident exercises planned for October and November. Members will receive details of those exercises upon completion of that exercise in November. From the 4th of September, there was a request that number plate recognition be considered by parking officers as a way to combat stop and shop infringements. That was put to Roy Clark, the parking manager, who has since confirmed that current legislation does not allow local authorities to use automatic number plate recognition for enforcement purposes. I do have a more detailed response to that, and I'll be forwarding that to committee following this meeting. At the same meeting, 4th September, there was a request that an information item on the enforcement of parking management schemes be considered for addition to the work programme. Following conversation with the Chairman, that will be considered for inclusion on the work programme for 2020-2021. And finally, that as part of this littering and fly tipping review, there was a request that officers draft a standard letter that councillors and residents could put to people that are known to be persistent offenders. That is currently in progress, and a draft will be provided to members once available. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. Item 5 is our review into littering and fly tipping within Hillingdon with our witness session. Good evening to you, Rose, and welcome to this committee. Whenever you're free to do so, please give your presentation. Could you use the microphone, please? Thank you.
Yes, I can. Hello, thank you for having me, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. So my name's Rose T, and I'm from Keep Britain Tidy's Centre for Social Innovation, which is the research and innovation hub for the charity. And I will tonight just be sharing some insights from our research around litter and fly tipping and what we're currently doing to tackle the issue. And I hope there's some ideas that you can get from what we're doing that you could perhaps look at implementing in your areas. So hopefully you find it useful. Go to turn it on. Okay, so this is the Centre for Social Innovation's approach in a nutshell. It's very much evidence-led, and I'll talk you through how it works using an example of an intervention to tackle dog fouling. First of all, what I mean by intervention is anything designed to change a behaviour. So we test all sorts of things to change behaviour, and they can include tweaks to existing services and products that you offer, or whole new ways of doing things. Okay, so back in 2013 now, we had a lot of feedback from local authorities saying that they really wanted us to do something to tackle dog fouling, because they were receiving a lot of complaints about the issue from the public. Interestingly, when we've looked at the issue of complaints from the public versus what you actually find on the ground in terms of counts of dog fouling, dog fouling is actually quite low down in terms of amounts of litter on the ground. But perceptions are important. So if people perceive an issue to be there, that has an influence on their perceptions of the local area, and also of what their, I guess, fellow residents are doing and how much they care for the area. So it's still important to tackle those issues. So in our approach, we start off with define, and in this case, we knew that dog walkers weren't picking up after their dogs, and simply we wanted them to pick up. So it's just keeping it simple there. So we went out and did our research, and when we do our research, we do things like behavioural observations, interviews with the public, focus groups, interviews with operatives, etc. And in this case, we did our research, and what we found is that dog walkers know that they should pick up, so it's not an education issue, it's an awareness issue, and I guess that was really important for us, because we could have spent all of these resources going out trying to educate the public when they already knew that they should be picking up, and that's really important for us in terms of developing solutions that are effective and low cost as well. But what we did find in this research is that people who don't pick up do so when they think they're not being watched, and that was kind of the key behavioural insight in this case. So we thought, okay, we get to the design phase. How can we make dog walkers feel that they are being watched? Well, we're aware of this study at Newcastle University using images of eyes watching to prevent bicycle theft at bike racks, and that was really effective in reducing thefts at those racks. But what they found is it actually displaced the issue to other locations where the eyes weren't there. So we wanted to avoid that. But we took inspiration from this approach because of this eyes watching issue. So we developed 4 different posters to put out at dog fouling hotspots. And one was just the plainest version of the poster with just the eyes watching. The next one was an enforcement message. The next one along is a positive reinforcement message or a social norming message. So this one says 9 out of 10 dog walkers do pick up. Are you the one that doesn't? And finally, we had a peer influence message asking people to report those who don't clean up to the council. So we wanted to test these 4 different messaging approaches. But the real innovation here is that we made them glow in the dark so that they could be seen at night time when dog fouling tends to be worse, when people think they're not being watched and they can get away with it. So they charge up during the day, they glow at night. We went and partnered with 17 local authorities. We tested the posters at 128 target sites, and our lovely partners counted dog poos for 4 weeks before the posters went in and 4 weeks after. So just over 4,600 poos counted in total. And we did interviews with our partners to understand what worked well and what didn't so much. So here are the results, really effective overall. And the social norming message was the more effective message, which is really interesting because that kind of aligns with other research on these types of approaches. And luckily, it was our most popular one with local authorities because it's a positive message. So we're now scaling that up across the country for broader impact, and that brings us around to the circle. People have used the research in their academic papers, and we've won some awards, which has been nice. So we've had broader influence beyond dog fouling, which has been really good. So that's just to briefly explain the approach, the evidence-based behavioural insights approach that we take. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on litter because we have a lot to say on fly tipping, and I think the littering insights, you probably know a lot of them already. So I'll just quickly touch on the key kind of behavioural drivers of littering. Just briefly, when we've done our research, we have been able to bust a lot of myths, I guess. So littering is done by all ages, not just young people. Young people tend to litter more when they're with friends and in groups, and this is linked to this idea of it being a kind of low-impact rebellion. Older people litter when they're by themselves, very discreetly, and we've seen a lot of that through our behavioural observations. So the reason people litter is because they see litter as low priority. People have a low personal obligation to hold on to an item and go and find a bin. They're also not so willing to deal with messy rubbish such as fast food and sticky items. There's also a lack of understanding about the broader consequences of littering, but we feel like this is changing since the Blue Planet effect. And we feel like there's a really high awareness of littering as an issue amongst younger people at the moment, which is really positive. And we all know that litter breeds litter. There's this idea from our research, which we find in fly tipping as well, that someone else will deal with it. So they know that the street's cleansed every day pretty much. So they see it as low impact. Here's one of the key myths that we're trying to bust, because when we go out and talk to people, they often tell us that more bins, we just need more bins and that'll solve litter. This is just an example of one piece of research which shows that bins don't make a huge difference. You know, people will litter regardless of whether there's a bin present or not. And also, more bins has a huge impact on the quality of our local environment anyway. They can be, you know, magnets for fly tipping, they block pavements, etc. So obviously that's not the only solution to tackling littering. So some things that we're doing at the moment to tackle littering. This first one is just a nudge-style intervention. What we found is a lot of people do this thing that we're calling careful littering, where they put cups on a ledge, or they'll put, you know, something on top of the bin, just tidily put it away, sandwiches on a bench, etc. So we've developed some materials like window stickers and floor stickers and posters that look like those types of litter that you often see littered, and it's just calling out this behaviour in a fun kind of way. So you can get that from us as a package at the moment. This one was about tackling dog fouling, and I wanted to share this as an example of an intervention where you don't necessarily have to talk about the issue that you're trying to target. So in this instance, we did a big piece of research on people littering bagged dog poo and hanging it in trees and on fences and stuff. And the most commonly used excuse for that was that there were no bins around, funnily enough. So we wanted to address this perception. So we created these fun dog walking routes that had different sizes for different health and fitness levels of different dogs. We made it really fun, and we made it all about the health and well-being of dog and dog walker. And we didn't mention dog fouling, but the routes were marked out by bins with these brightly coloured route markers on them to nudge people along a route where they're more likely to come across a bin. This is a somewhat controversial one. So we'd heard anecdotal evidence from overseas and here actually, that when you remove bins from certain locations, that can actually have a positive impact on litter levels. And we think it's to do with this idea that people are more careful with what they do with their rubbish because they're prompted by the fact that there's no bin there, so they take it with them. Now, we tested this in 3 parks. We've had mixed results, so we do want to test it further. What we found is that the amount of waste left in those parks decreased by 68%, which is huge, and that means that your operatives don't have to deal with that waste, which has a positive impact on your costs, you know, your resources. Now, at 2 of those parks, well, at all parks, the park managers said that there was a visible reduction in litter on the ground, but our monitoring found that actually at 2 of those parks, litter did increase slightly. So we do want to do more testing, but it did have a positive impact on fly tipping because people were taking rubbish and dumping them around the bins. So if you don't want to take bins away from parks completely, you might want to look at things like moving bins inward slightly if your bins in the edges of parks are kind of magnets for household fly tipping, like bags of rubbish and stuff. So that's been interesting. And this is just a simple intervention to tackle vehicle littering, which I'm sure you're aware of, using roadside wildflowers to beautify an area and discourage littering in those areas. So our results so far are showing have been quite positive, almost 50% reduction at 2 of our sites. So further testing on that one is happening at the moment. Okay, so I just wanted to now talk through our fly tipping research. So I'll just go back. We've just completed around 3 years of research into fly tipping behaviours, and we've very much focused on domestic small-scale fly tipping, because when we looked at council data, that was overwhelmingly, I guess, the most prevalent type of fly tipping and the one that had the biggest cost impacts for local authorities. I'm not sure if that's the case here. I've done a bit of nosing around on the website and seen that you're also dealing with huge mile-long fly tips as well in this area. So that's a different behaviour. That's about stopping residents from giving waste to unscrupulous operators. Whereas what I'm talking about now is stopping people from putting their own rubbish out onto the street. So and just to quickly touch on what we did, we've done kind of like 9 focus groups with 79 residents who fly tipped, and they fly tipped within the last year, and they had to have done a few different types of fly tipping. And we did crew ride-alongs and interviews with operatives who deal with fly tipping, and all sorts of research, and an online survey with 1,000 residents in London. And what we found from this research is that there is a lack of awareness of what constitutes fly tipping. People really don't understand what it is, and when you ask people what is fly tipping, they tend to recall these big, messy incidents, the type that you see on TV and in newspapers, and they don't recognise their own behaviours of fly tipping, or that of maybe someone they know who might fly tip. So tackling awareness won't solve the issue, but it's a good basic first step that we recommend looking at. So just on this research, when we did a survey, we asked people if they understood the term fly tipping, and 91% of respondents said that they did. Now, when we showed them 12 different photographs of different types of fly tipping and littering and some dummy type photographs, only 1% correctly identified all of those incidents of fly tipping. And we've also found that there is a difference, as you might expect, when you're engaging UK nationals and non-UK nationals. So people from overseas are much less likely to understand the term. So we did a focus group in Harrow, for example, with Romanian residents, alongside other residents in a separate focus group. But when we asked them, have you heard of the term fly tipping, not a single person in that room of 12 people had ever heard of the term. And they told us that there's no literal translation of the term. And the closest translation is the illegal disposal of garbage. Now, I've looked at your website, and really happily you're using good terms like dumped rubbish instead of fly tipping, so that's really positive. But yeah, we would recommend looking at all of your communications. Here's an example of, I guess, probably not how to communicate when it comes to domestic fly tipping. So this says no fly tipping, and it also refers to this penalty of £50,000, which is totally disproportionate to what people might see as their own behaviour, which is more in line with the £400 fine. So we would recommend looking at how you talk about the issue and how you talk about enforcement. Another key finding has been that there is an expectation that fly tips will be collected quickly and without repercussions. So people put their rubbish out on the street, and it often disappears within a matter of hours, and they don't even think about who's taken it. They just assume maybe it's someone who wants the item, or if it's rubbish, they know that the council goes through every night at 6 p.m. or something, so it's a learned behaviour. And what this does is it reinforces this idea that I guess that people can fly tip. There's no feedback loop on the behaviour. It will just keep disappearing and nothing will happen. And it also indicates that it's kind of low impact because nothing happens. So we would recommend looking at crime scene investigation tape to tackle this issue. You may be aware of it. What happens is at your target locations, or even across a whole ward or across the whole borough, every single fly tip that operatives come across, they tape it with this crime scene investigation tape, and they leave it in place for 3 days. And the idea is that people have an opportunity to see it, especially the person who did it and or their neighbours. We've tested this in Newham. In the first month, there was a 63% reduction in fly tipping, and that continued. We did quite a long-term trial, which just finished yesterday, actually. After 17 weeks, it had reduced by 78% from the baseline period. So it's had a huge impact. And the operatives who we were working with were quite reluctant to try this approach. They didn't think it would work, and they didn't want to leave fly tips out for 3 days. But happily, they love the approach now. They want to roll it out to other areas, and they actually want to leave it there for 5 days. So it's up to Newham to decide, and their members. But we're now going to do 3 new trials in different areas in London. But I really strongly recommend something like this approach. If you don't want to leave fly tips there for 3 days, you could think about other interventions to close that feedback loop on the behaviour. So you could think about stencils under the fly tips. We've also wanted to test doing leaflets where you take a picture of the fly tip, stick it on the leaflet template and leaflet that street. It's all about really personalised direct feedback, and that's what makes it work. We did perception surveys alongside that pilot and had some really good results. So 67% felt that the intervention made them realise that dumping waste on the streets is illegal. As I said, I had a nosy around the websites, your website and other people's websites to look at the issue here in Hillingdon. And I did notice some residents complaining about like a particular hotspot on a street corner or something. And you could see that people were using it. It was a known dumping ground. And they'd just you guys would clear it, they'd come back, clear it, come back. So this could be a really effective way to deal with that type of issue. I'll skip that. Our research has also found that there is a lack of understanding about the impacts of fly tipping, and this is linked to a lack of understanding about how council waste systems work. So people think, and this is important for the people who fly tip who kind of may or may not realise it's bad, you know, the lower hanging fruit. People think that the council's already out there collecting rubbish, so they may as well collect mine while I'm at it, and that has a low impact. They don't understand that every fly tip has a cost implication. And when you talk this through with these fly tippers in these focus groups, you know that fly tipping takes money away from other services such as education, healthcare, etc. But they are really shocked. And I don't think we talk about that enough, you know, the whole system and this idea that it is taking away from services that they care about. And when we've done research on values-based communications in other projects, what we found is that, you know, looking at a spectrum where you've got people who are not engaged with environmental issues at all, right through to people who are quite engaged on a day-to-day basis, right across that whole spectrum, there are certain shared values that people commonly care about and that they commonly hold, and they are things like healthcare, education, etc. So if you're appealing to these types of things, you've got a good way to engage people across that whole spectrum. I better finish up soon. Our research also found that there are some things that councils are doing that are unintentionally driving fly tipping. So, one example is side waste rules, which is where councils don't allow bags of rubbish next to wheelie bins on collection day, and people have learned that they won't get their rubbish collected, so they'll take it off to the street where they know it will be collected. That's not an issue for you guys because you do bags of rubbish. But rules and practices that increase the hassle factor of booking bulky waste collections, taking stuff to recycling banks, taking stuff to the tip, etc., does have a huge impact in terms of people's willingness to do the right thing. When we were really interested in our research to see how much does cost have an impact compared to convenience, and we still haven't really got to the bottom of that, to be honest. But I suspect from our research that convenience edges cost. People do fly tip because it's the easiest thing to do. It's convenient, it's free. So you might find even with your free bulky waste collection that people still fly tip because it's a hassle booking the bulky waste collection. Okay, how am I going for time, Neil? Yeah, sure. Let me just... Oh, okay. We know that there's very high awareness of enforcement amongst people, but there is a very low perceived threat of actually getting caught. So what this tells us is that our enforcement isn't visible enough and not enough of a threat. The CSI take intervention that I mentioned before is a really good way to tackle that effectively, but there are other things you can do, such as letterbox drops in areas where you're doing enforcement, etc. I'm going to keep moving to my summary. Overall, what we'd say is that there is no silver bullet for fly tipping, and that's the most important thing, I guess, to be aware of. We would say first get the basics right, like your communications, the ease of using services and infrastructure, etc., increasing the visibility of enforcement and closing that feedback loop on the behaviour. That's the most important thing. Then you can look at doing targeted behavioural interventions to tackle specific issues, like this lack of understanding around waste services, etc. Tell people why it matters and help them to join the dots. So make people aware of these broader social impacts. And there's a graph just to kind of help visualise that. At the end of this presentation, I've got lots and lots of examples of our interventions to tackle fly tipping, so that'll be available to you guys and the public, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Rose, and for the benefit of members, I have spoken to Neil. This will be distributed to members outside of the meeting, the full presentation, along with the slides. I invite questions from members, and we'll start with Councillor Markham, please.
Thank you, Rose. That's a wow. I mean, thank you so much. It was incredible to know what you've been doing, and it's all evidence-based, which is very helpful.
Yeah.
We have about 157 different languages spoken here in Hillingdon, and I wondered whether your research has looked into the question of language.
Yeah. Only what I mentioned, which was the research with Romanian residents and also the online survey in which we asked non-UK nationals, but that's the extent of it. What we are doing more and more is co-design workshops with residents from different groups, such as ones that you've mentioned, to kind of understand the issue from their perspective. So as an example, residents in European countries are often legitimately allowed to just put rubbish out on the street, and they never get told when they come to England sometimes. So we are doing co-design workshops with translators, etc., to try and co-design communications and also interventions to support them better. So.
Thank you. Councillor Markham, do you have a supplementary?
Well, I do. One of the problems we have here, and I'm sure it's very common, is that tenants in flats, we have a very transient population here.
Yeah.
And landlords fail, it seems to us, to tell their tenants about the rubbish collection of a local authority. Has your research found that? Is that a common thing? And what do you think you can do, or indeed we can do, to involve landlords in getting them to educate their tenants as to best practice in litter?
For sure. Definitely an issue that is being experienced across so many local authorities at the moment. And one of the biggest issues is you can't rely on communications or education because you'd have to be constantly drip feeding, and we can't afford that. It's just too resource intensive. One thing that we're about to pilot with Hounslow and Havering are leave behind welcome packs. So they're not the usual kind of pack of leaflets, but it's kind of a three-dimensional thing that's got information, and we're trying to make it not just about waste. It's about things to help you get settled into this community. So it might be signposting them to specific community groups. etc. But information about waste and recycling is very much at the top of that to indicate that it's really important. So part of this pilot is that we're co-designing those packs with residents from the target locations. So we don't know what they'll look like yet, but we think that one of the biggest challenges is that they need to be leave behind. So how do we leave them there? As part of that, we're looking to work with local authorities, landlords, to co-design and distribute the packs. But from my previous experience, it's been really challenging engaging landlords. They're often absent. In some areas, you know, they have good relationships with some landlords, which is useful. But in this pilot, we're thinking of trying to bypass them, so we're not just relying on them. But I would welcome the opportunity to work with landlords if you have a good relationship with them. So, yeah.
Sorry, to get that information.
Councillor Kaufman.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Rose. That was a really enlightening presentation. The use of crime scene investigation tape, does this not conflict with the police, or are the police okay with this?
Yes.
I think it's a brilliant idea.
Yes. Well, someone did have the idea of using police tape, but of course we wouldn't be allowed blue and white. So we use the yellow and black tape, and then we have a sticker that goes on it that just says very simply fine £400 to go alongside that. So, yeah, luckily we have a report coming out from Newham, and I'll look at the comments from that just to make sure, but I'm pretty sure no one has mentioned police, but I'll check.
Okay. That's fine.
Do you wish to follow up?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Many years ago, your organisation did a national thing, Keep Britain Tidy, and it was there. It was a brand. It was like Kellogg's cornflakes.
Mm.
Is that currently still sort of the case? I mean, does your Keep Britain Tidy go across the whole piece?
Yeah, and actually that was one thing I was meant to mention, which is what we now have is our annual Great British Spring Clean.
Right.
So last year we had 500,000 people litter pick in that, which was brilliant. This year, it'll be early next year in April, we're aiming for 600,000 people taking part. And the idea behind that is that we're getting the public to demonstrate that littering is unacceptable, that they won't accept it in their community, that they're willing to take action to tackle it, and also to engage people who wouldn't normally litter pick in, the monthly kind of community group litter pick. So it's getting new people involved. We think that when people litter pick, when they've had that experience, they're less likely to litter themselves. So we're trying to gather evidence on that. It's been a bit tricky so far. But we do know from our research from this year's Great British Spring Clean that something like 73% of respondents felt like they had made a difference and were part of a national campaign, and all of these positive kind of outcomes from it. So what I would encourage Hillingdon to do is sign up for the Great British Spring Clean. You can sign up now. You get a package of resources to help promote it. I think we're looking at giving away bags, but I'm not sure, for the general rubbish and the recyclables. And we've got resources to help get different groups of people engaged.
No, come back after. Councillor Dillon.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a bit of evidence, really, for you. In my ward, we had a bin put next to a quiet road and a bus stop, and it was about 2 or 3 years ago. And slowly, you saw the level of rubbish next to that bin increase. I mean, to the point where and I don't know why you would put a mattress next to a litter bin, but those kinds of things, weight press benches and things started to appear. It took about 6 months to get rid of that bin.
Right.
But significantly, the litter went from a couple of rubbish bags after that bin had gone to now nothing in weeks.
Brilliant.
And that's one of those things that where you said you've got to strategically place the bins. They don't have to be everywhere.
Yeah.
If you don't know where to dump it, then I think responsible people will just keep the rubbish with them, dump it at home.
Yeah.
But we do have an issue in the borough where we've mentioned rented accommodation, but we have an outbuilding problem as well. And I think we have people from outbuildings dumping into or by our rubbish bins.
Okay.
So that's an issue that maybe could come back to committee. But I don't know if you guys have tackled, you mentioned landlords, if you have tackled anything with landlords actually dumping, because they actually dump cupboards, mattresses, all kinds of carpets after someone's left, after a year or so. It just all comes out and they cannot be bothered, or it's cost too much, obviously, for them to take it to the civic amenity site.
Yeah.
So they'll just leave it out there, and it's up to us guys to report it and get it collected. I don't know if they've tackled that kind of issue.
So just for information as well, this was mentioned in the minutes from the last meeting where residents raised that specific issue, specifically when tenants move out and landlords take possession of the property. Yeah. So you're right to touch on that, Councillor Dillon. Rose, did you want to answer that, sorry?
We haven't specifically done anything on that issue yet, but I feel like there's so much scope for things that we can trial. And the other gap in our research is HMOs, or houses in multiple occupations. So we're really keen to do some research specifically on that issue. But the issue of landlords clearing out is a tricky one because, we don't know if they're I guess they're not absentee landlords, are they? If they're coming in and I guess we'd love to pilot some new interventions, but we don't have any evidence yet, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Councillor Dillon, do you wish to follow up at all? Okay. Councillor Tuckwell?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman, and again, thanks for the presentation. You mentioned in your piece there about the knowledge of enforcement is high, but the perception that people will get caught and fined is quite low.
Yeah.
What's the magic ingredient to kind of switch that?
Yeah, it's about increasing the visibility of enforcement, I think, and that's why I think the CSI tape is a good low-cost way to do that, because it's so hard to have enforcement officers. I mean, we're all kind of having cuts to our local authority resources, etc. And this gives people an opportunity to see that something is being done in relation to that particular fly tip when they're going past at different times of day. Or another approach is to leaflet that specific street with information about that specific fly tip, like that photo that I mentioned, you stick it on. So that's what I would say, because a lot of local authorities are talking about their prosecutions or their enforcement activity on social media, which is fantastic, but it's having limited impact. It's not reaching the people that it needs to reach. So anything on that direct feedback loop that talks about enforcement or makes it more visible, I think would be quite effective.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, just as a follow-up, it builds on Councillor Dillon's point there about reducing bins, and the one you mentioned earlier about reducing bins in parks.
Yeah.
Interestingly, you suggested that there was a reduction in litter, which bears what's been said, but was there any communication that went with that to the sort of local area, or was it just that one of those nudging effects?
I'm glad you asked about that, actually. So when we did it, it was a pilot, and in all of our pilots, depending on the intervention, we generally don't draw attention to it because we want to test it in its own right, in isolation from, I guess, making people aware. In this case, that was a big mistake because we should have brought along the Friends of groups from the beginning. Now, they're aware of it now, and, they're supportive of the trial now that they know what it's all about, but at the time they were really upset and really angry, and we had some dirty protests, like people leaving bags of dog poo in piles where the bins used to be, etc. So one of our strongest recommendations from that research was you must inform those, more active local residents, the Friends of groups, the residents groups, as a minimum, and then potentially others. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Eggington. Can you use your microphone, please?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think, just an aside, that the idea of taking away bins is more of a problem with dog excrement, obviously.
Yeah.
People don't want to be carrying a bag for 2 or 3 miles and then take it home in their car or whatever. But anyway, that was just an aside. The main point I was going to ask about was littering side of roads. Now, I know that there have been significant problems over the years with major roads. with different authorities being responsible for example, mowing and littering, and collecting litter, and the two not being joined up, so that sometimes you can have mowing, so one lane is perhaps coned off, they mow, they find lots of litter which is then destroyed and then can't be collected at all. So you're actually producing more waste, which is then left and maybe bits of plastic. Is there anything which can be done about this? Because clearly that is an area around the airport particularly, and around the motorways and the major roads, where there are real problems. In saying all of that, I know that there is one resident of Hillingdon, Peter Silverman, I don't know if anybody knows him, who runs a Clean Highways website, and he's been campaigning on this issue for enormous amount of time. He's actually taken people to court, Transport for London and the Highways Agency. Sometimes he's lost. It's cost him a fortune because he ended up with about £7,000 bill on one occasion. But he's been trying this, and it doesn't seem to achieve a great deal. He tries to highlight these problems.
I know, it's really challenging, and we've had a similar issue trying to bring all of those people into the room. I can't remember who the operator is on that stretch of, it's not Highways England. It's Connect someone. We've had kind of I guess a good response initially, but when it comes to actually getting people into the room, we've really struggled, and we think that we probably haven't been aiming high enough. The struggle that we've been having is that you've got the Highways Agency, but then you've got this local road manager. That's been a real struggle for us. Same experience, I guess, getting people together in a room and timing those, like having a calendar of activity across the year would be useful. In terms of preventing the littering from occurring in the first place, we've got a campaign called Don't Be a Tosser, which is aimed at vehicle littering. Our research found that it tends to be younger male drivers, and it's very much aimed at that demographic. And we have a new big campaign coming out actually in the new year, which is around what a lot of people don't realise is that discarded bottles and cans actually attract small mammals. And we did a piece of research, and it estimated that something like 9.2 billion, I'll have to check that figure, it's huge. Small mammals die each year in these cans and bottles, which have been listed on roadsides and other locations. And often, this guy who did the research, Graham Motes, he often found, 8 small mammals in the one container. So they, as long as they're in the environment, they continue to attract animals and kill them, which is really sad. So we did some focus groups with people who litter these items and tested messaging. Do they actually care about small mammal deaths? Maybe they don't care. But actually, we found that they did care, and that it was quite a kind of a message that resonated with them. So we've developed a campaign on the back of that, and on their kind of recommendations about what the campaign should look like. And that will be coming out in the new year, and it's got billboards and things like that. So you could look at those types of approaches. But in answer to your question, it's not something, I think bringing people together in a room is a struggle, and we've struggled.
Councillor Egerton, do you wish to follow up?
Yes. The one thing I'm not sure your research really covered was whether, if you have a lot of litter in an area, whether that actually encourages more people to litter, further litter, on the basis that they just assume it doesn't really matter at that point, whereas if it's completely clear, do they start to litter?
I guess the most famous research goes back to the broken windows theory, and we've done our own research to build on that, and that has found that people are more likely to litter in an environment that's littered, definitely. But interestingly, we found that there are certain types of litter that are more likely to attract further littering, and we call these beacons of litter. And they are things like brightly coloured cans and bottles, fast food packaging, big items that stand out. They attract further littering more compared to little small items of litter. So if you have a street, say, where it makes sense for you to move through that site really quickly a few times a day, just getting the big stuff, and then do your really deep cleanse maybe that evening, you know, you could look at things like that. We know that it has an impact on rates of littering, so, yeah.
Thank you. Councillor McMahon.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your report. You've mentioned raising awareness is really important, as is educating within our community. I'm interested to know what kind of role or how you're involved with children, schools, young people.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So Keep Britain Tidy runs the Eco Schools program, which is fantastic, and that takes school children through various kind of modules around biodiversity, water, littering, etc. Now, that's a different team, so I can't give you too much information now because I'll probably just say the wrong thing. But it's a huge program, and they have something like 14,000 schools signed up, so that information would be on the website. What we've done recently is workshops in schools on fly tipping, which has been really fun. And we feel like it really worked. There's a slide in here that's got some results that you can see once you receive the slide pack. But we went in, we did a workshop with school children around, you know, waste, what fly tipping is. We focused on the waste hierarchy, you know, so reduce, reuse, recycle, and tried to talk about it in that context. And then they went off and they had a 1-week diary task where they had to look at fly tipping in their area and record information about it. And then they came back in a second workshop and co-designed solutions to tackle fly tipping with us, and we made a video for the council out of that, which they'll now use as a campaign video. And I was really sceptical, to be honest. I thought, how big an impact is this going to have, really? But I feel like it will have an impact. Obviously, in the longer term, we might not see a reduction in fly tips. We'll have results coming out in a couple of months. But we went in and did the 4 primary schools in this one small ward. It'd be amazing if we see an impact, but I think if we keep doing this program, it has to have an effect in the longer term. It's been really positive, yeah.
Okay. I believe all the members have indicated they wish to ask questions. They have done so. So before I go back to people wanting to ask second sets of questions, is there any other members who wish to ask questions who haven't done so yet? No? Okay. I'll start with Councillor Kaufman then. We have been doing this for about 45 minutes now, so if we can keep the questions and answers brief so we can move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. We have a fairly prolific litter picking team in the ward that I represent, and that's grown from 2 or 3 people to around about 15 now. And we have volunteers on all our coats and all the rest of it. And we often get mistaken for community service people, but we also get thanked from the community. And we've also got nurseries involved, etc., etc. And I was just sort of looking at, sort of, say, the Macmillan Coffee Morning and your day of, I can't remember what it was called now.
The Great British Spring Clean, yep.
Yeah. I think that would be a magic thing to try and, you know, instill in areas, you know, to have that one day where we focus, get people out on the streets, you know.
It's a great idea.
But that's really all I have to say,
yeah,
Chairman. Thank you.
It's a great idea, too.
I just want to pick up the issue that Tony raised about highways and particularly around roundabouts and such like. And I wondered whether you've done any work with transport companies, with utility companies, that level, sort of, or the Road Transport Association.
Yeah.
Because in my experience, it's frequently van drivers and lorry drivers who chuck stuff out of their windows.
Yeah. Now, I'm sure you could find this online, but one of our Keep Britain Tidy award winners, we have awards for good practice, one year was North Leicestershire Council, I think. They did this fantastic piece on lorry driving and littering from those vehicles. And what they found is that when they engage lorry drivers, that they're really limited in terms of where they can go just for self-care. So, you know, eating, getting a shower without spending money, etc. And maybe felt like they didn't have the permission to do that from their employer as well. And this led to things like, you know, eating in the cab, wanting to get rid of it quickly because that's where they sleep, it's kind of their home. And so they developed some interventions to try and tackle these perceptions and also the issue. Now, I don't know the details of what they did, but it's a great piece of research, so I really recommend looking for it online.
Sorry, which borough was this?
I think it was North Leicestershire Council. I can send a follow-up email to Neil if you like. It was either North Leicestershire or North East Lincolnshire, maybe.
Right, that would be really helpful because we have a lot of transport. We have a lot of transport companies, you know, working out of the airport and everything else, and using the M25 and the M40. So that would be very useful. Thank you.
Can I ask a really quick question?
Yes.
I know that Heathrow has a place where drivers can go and they pay £1 and they can park. I think it's for private hire vehicles. I'm not sure that it's for truck drivers, but that could be something to look into. And they can get a shower and food and stuff.
Note that, Neil. Yeah. Councillor Tuckwell.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Clearly you've done a lot of research and have some good practice from various parts of the country. How do you think Hillingdon can work closer with your organisation and collaborate?
Yeah. Well, I guess one way to work with this effectively could be to join our Keep Britain Tidy network, which is a network of local authorities. And there are a range of benefits from that, such as discounts on our campaigns. We sell campaigns in a box, like just off-the-shelf campaigns based on our behavioural insights approaches. Discounts on enforcement training and other types of training. And it's just they have meetings where they share best practice across the different local authorities. So that's one approach. And my team, which is the research and innovation team, when we're looking to pilot a new intervention, we first of all do a call for partners out through that network, and if we can't find the right partner, we go more broadly. So that's one opportunity to work with us. There's a Great British Spring Clean, Eco Schools. We've got a Waste Insights team, and they work on recycling and food waste and all sorts of things. So yeah, I guess just to keep in touch. The other thing I should say is that because we're a charity, a lot of the work that my team does is funded by individual local authorities. So a lot of this work has come through our work with Newham and Stevenage and Welland Hatfield and the London Environment Directors Network. So if you have something that you do want to look at tackling through research or for trialling a new intervention and you have funding to do so, you can come straight to us. Great.
Thank you.
Cheers.
And Councillor Dillon.
Thank you, Chairman. And it does all come down to funding. I was going to ask a similar question. Have you guys done a sort of a study where you've gone into a council, advised them, they've taken a package, there's obviously then resource involved in creating the package and delivering it, and the cost-benefit analysis into what that could possibly save in terms of people picking rubbish up, etc.?
Yeah, of course. We've always wanted to, but in practice it's been a lot more difficult because a lot of councils, their costs are all kind of combined, so they'll have one cost for doing street bins and litter, and it's kind of hard to separate the two out, if that makes sense, and do that cost-benefit analysis. So it's something that we've always wanted to do. Another thing I should mention is that we do provide those sorts of consultancy services. So next year we're looking at working intensively with one council to really kind of transform how they tackle fly tipping, looking across those 4 areas of communication, services and infrastructure, etc. So those kinds of opportunities are there if you're looking to do something like that. But what we hope from this relationship is that we'll have a better idea of cost-benefit analysis, but we don't have it at the moment. All we have is when we ask our partners if they think it's made a difference, and they tell us. So that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. And to finish off, Councillor Egginton.
Thank you, Chair. With regard to the investigation, the tape, I wonder whether it would be worthwhile trying to include the actual cost to the council of actually dealing with it, because you've mentioned about the penalty and that in the circulation, but actually trying to estimate what having a team to collect fly tipping on a regular basis. Whether that might, I don't know whether that's been thought about or...
Well, one of the interventions we want to try, which is in this deck as well, is putting giant price tags on fly tips. We think it would be a good comms piece, and it's kind of that direct feedback loop, and that would talk about the cost of collecting the fly tips. When we've tested this with local authorities, they said, this is great, we just want to make sure people don't think that's how much it would cost to get collected through the right so we just have to make sure our messaging is right. In Newham, we did test stencils that talked about, just in general terms, waste dumped here takes money away from schools. That's kind of messaging. Schools, exactly. So we'll have some results from that, but we know from our other trials that if you have an actual figure like you've suggested, it adds authority to messaging and people take more notice of it. And so, we would definitely recommend that approach,
Thank you very much, and thank you, Rose, for your presentation this evening. And on behalf of the committee, thank you. It's been very valuable.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Item 6 is the update on the review into the Council's current and future relationship with academies and free schools. Welcome to you, Dan. I understand you'll be giving the presentation, and also Chris, when you're ready to do so, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got in front of me the review tracker. I must say I only started on the 19th of August, so some of this is still new to me. So in your review tracker, the one outstanding action is to revise the school improvement framework, and that work is now well underway and takes the form of a school improvement strategy, which is in draft form, and myself and Dan are working with the lead member to actually produce something that we will then undertake a full consultation process on. Since August, I have visited 27 Hillingdon schools, 11 of which have been academies, and although this is in draft form, I've had the opportunity to discuss some of the principles with head teachers about the strategy and the direction in which it's going, and to get a view of their thoughts on the sorts of things that we should be proposing. So just to give you a brief sort of summary of the thinking, it really is what head teachers are saying is that really they want to understand the local authority's position in terms of school improvement and its relationships with academies and with maintained schools. They want to know how ambitious we are for schools, and they want to know about how we are going to broker, challenge and support schools. So in that last aspect, I've called on previous experience of working in 6 other local authorities to start to think about what that might look like. And what I know works well elsewhere has been a very transparent model where schools can clearly look at a document and they can see what the local authority thinking on that school would be. So we've really focused in on 3 categories of school. The school that is self-improving, so typically, but not universally, may be an outstanding or a good school in Ofsted terms, which has an upward trajectory of results, settled staff, low incidences of exclusions and high attendance, for example. And then those schools will not need a huge amounts of support from the local authority. They may need some discussions about where they can access support and what partnerships they can form. A second group is then what we're labelling in targeted schools, where they might need 1 or 2 key areas of support to actually enable them to move forward. Where leadership is typically good, but they might just need, but capacity might be an issue, and they might need some specific support. That could be on a subject basis like mathematics, for example, or it could be support on developing a more effective school improvement plan. And then the schools that are really going to capture a lot of our attention will be those that need more intensive support. So schools that are not offering a good quality of education and really need and are facing some difficult and at times complex challenges where they do need local authority support to work with them and to broker support from elsewhere to help them to move forward. So that's broadly the strategy. What we're basing that if you like categorisation of schools on is the intelligence that we collect on schools. So the data, attendance figures, exclusion figures, SEM indicators, and we're undertaking with every maintained school a curriculum and standards visit this term to really understand where schools are in their school improvement journey, and that meeting has been offered to academies as well, so that we would be able to work with academies to offer them that element of support and challenge to really understand how to prepare for an Ofsted inspection that they might face, but also to unpick some of the data that the school's students and pupils have produced in the 2019 outcomes. So that's broadly the strategy that we're working on in terms of that revised improvement framework.
Thank you very much, Chris. I invite members' questions. Mr. Little, did you indicate first?
You mentioned that you've been visiting the maintained and some academies.
Yes, 11 academies out of 27 schools visited.
Have there been academies that have refused visit?
No, so far no. They've been. I wrote to all schools when I took up post, and it's really been. My diary is still full to the end of term with visits. I'm hoping I'll have visited most, if not all, of the secondary academies by the end of term.
Mr. Little, do you wish to follow up?
Has there been any difference in the type of engagement that you've had? Do you find it a different quality engagement with the academies than maintained?
What I'm picking up is across Hillingdon, the schools want to work with the local authority. They do see the local authority as a role as having a role to play. That work might be on different levels, but one of the things that I need to do is to really ensure that the relationships and the if you like the trust level between academy schools and the local authority is high, and that we know that they know that we're working with them on that common agenda of raising outcomes for young people who attend Hillingdon schools, regardless of the governance arrangement in those schools.
Thank you. Councillor Eggington? Use your microphone, please.
I ought to declare an interest as I'm a governor of 2 primary schools, maintained primary schools. I wonder, the various 6 points here, the answer to one, for example, which is the one relating to strongly encourages all school governors to have in place satisfactory induction and CPD arrangements. The lead officer commentary seems to be only to do with maintained schools, really. I appreciate
in which one, sorry?
This is on page 34, which is the 4th.
Okay.
Unfortunately, they aren't numbered, which
no.
makes it more difficult. But there you'll see that the
yes.
answer seems
yes.
to be... I appreciate that it's very difficult because clearly academies and free schools are apart from the local authority to a great extent. And I wonder whether there is any way in which the local authority should or could be assessing that area of academies?
Well, what we are going to be doing is we've got a governor training evening on the 26th of November coming up, and one of the things that we will look at there is how we can support governance in all schools, and thereby having a greater picture. At the moment, for one reason or another, historical, we haven't got that overview of governance, and that is something that we do need, and that hopefully that event is going to help us to start to establish that picture of governance across all schools in Hillingdon.
Councillor Egginton.
Thank you, Chris. On a related but slightly different tack, I know that there are some very small, the studio colleges, for example. There are, at least from my knowledge from Schools Forum, some severe financial challenges, let's say, with those organisations. I don't know what support the local authority can give to those.
I don't know. Do you want to answer?
I mean, those studio schools are part of a wider multi-academy trust, and one particular trust in that it does have reserves, which I'm sure will be supporting the individual schools. I suppose it does kind of. What we know about those particular schools is that they do. The trust does assess individual pupils, and then so that the programme those pupils receive at those studio schools is best fit for those pupils. In terms of the finances, though, obviously it's a ring-fenced budget, the DSG, and therefore that's within the DSG more broadly. But in terms of the finances of that particular trust,
Thank you, Councillor Markham.
This item on the agenda is really an update on the work that you are doing, and therefore there's little point in us going into great detail because you're obviously still looking into it. So I've got one question in two parts.
Okay.
First one relates to timing. When will your review be ready, and will we as this committee have an opportunity to scrutinise it?
So Chris has done a good job. We've got a document in place that sets out pretty much what Chris has just described, and that draft school or refreshed school improvement strategy is more evolution really, rather than sort of revolution, if that makes sense. It's building on what we know does work well. So there's a draft document in place, and subject to member approval, it will be then available to all schools and others who wish to review it and comment on it. Absolutely.
So that is the opportunity for us to really go into the detail. Thank you.
Councillor Vardia.
Thank you, Chairman. My question focuses on those schools that you feel need more intensive support.
Yes.
I know that you're identifying them based on their attainment scores, and I was wondering if you're solely considering the attainment score as a whole, or whether you're perhaps looking at more detailed data. I know that data is published on outcomes for specific demographics within that school. So, for example, the children that have prior low attainment, children that are perhaps recipients of free school meals, children that speak English as a second language. And my question relates to whether you are identifying the schools where perhaps when you take the average, they look as though they are reaching very high levels of attainment, but when you drill down into the details, there are perhaps some demographics of students that perhaps aren't performing to the level.
I did say attainment, and I should have also said achievement, which is the progress that children make over time, and within that it would be groups as well as the whole cohort. But we aren't relying on just one indicator. It would be, some of the things we're working on are what does attendance look like, behaviour, the curriculum, the quality of teaching learning, the outcomes, the readiness for Ofsted, the quality of leadership. So it's making a judgment in the round rather than relying on one indicator. So, and why that's important, some schools have traditionally got by on having aspirational students, and that's masked things that are wrong in the school. I'm not thinking of a Hillingdon school here, but we need to understand what's actually happening in the school so that we can get a good judgment so that the trajectory of the school continues to be upwards.
Councillor Riley, okay. I have no one else wishing to ask questions unless there's anyone else. Mr. Little.
Thank you. On page 34, it refers to a Hillingdon local education area partnership. Can you say something about the ambitions and timescales for that?
Well, this was set up by my predecessor, and it was an excellent idea. And the idea is that we could create a platform for sharing courses and professional development opportunities across Hillingdon, so that schools that were offering something could put it onto a website, and other schools could see what was being offered and could book places on those courses. We've engaged under my predecessor and now under Riley Dady, we've engaged teaching schools particularly in this process, and they're fully engaged with offering their courses and their support through this online platform, and the idea is that it will go live hopefully at the start of January, and that it will then start to evolve. So it might start with courses specifically, but we could then start to look at networks, partnership opportunities through the same platform. So as it embeds and it gets recognition, we could start to build that into our communication strategy more effectively with schools about professional development and wider school issues.
Do you wish to follow up?
Thank you. The paper seems to suggest that this is particularly involving governors.
Well, I think there will be a governor's, as we evolve it, there will definitely be a governor's area within that platform.
Right, but it's got wider ambitions than that, is what you're suggesting. I was going to ask about the publicity. When would that start, and when would governors be made aware?
Okay, well, they will be made aware of it on the 26th of November, those who attend the training event, but we will be, there is a soft launch, we've been told, because apparently with a Razzmatazz launch, it tends to cause problems to the website if everybody tries to get on it all at one time. So we're going to try and phase that in sort of between now and February half term effectively. So it should be absolutely fit for purpose and working effectively next term.
Thank you, Councillor Markham.
Thanks. This is a very important subject.
Yes.
And obviously it concerns a lot of us. And I want to come back, however, to this issue of timing, because if we're going to do our job properly, we need to put it into the work plan. So, Dan, can you give us a better idea as to when this report will be finalised and when we have an opportunity to see it? And will it also give us an opportunity to assess the value of the governor training that you've been talking about?
Yeah, that's entirely reasonable. I think we could either be looking at the December or January meeting, if that's acceptable. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so it'll be January. Okay. Thank you very much for your report, Chris.
Thanks, Chairman.
You may stay if you wish, but if you wish to go, feel free to do so.
Tempting though that offer is.
I'm sure it is.
Chris, can you turn your mic off? Thank you.
Item 7, Agenda B, is the Special Education Need and Disability Service Provision. Welcome to you, Vikram. Whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening all. So, My name is Vikram Hensrani. I'm the newly appointed Assistant Director for SEND and Inclusion. So just completed my third week, and hopefully this report provides some narrative as to in terms of where we are. So I assume that the report's been read. I won't go through the report line by line. However, I will pick up on some key bits of information. Following this, I'm happy to respond to any questions that you may have. So essentially, this report is centred on two things. One, to provide members an update on the capital development plans that we have to boost SEND efficiencies within Hillingdon for our children and young people. And also, the second part is then regarding the transformation of the service that I've just taken over and how that will further support schools in Hillingdon. So if I start with the first item, and that's looking at capital developments. So we have a number of activities that are going on to develop our sufficiencies in Hillingdon. That's linked to the SEND Capital Expansion Grant, in which we've been provided near on £5 million from central government to develop our existing provision, as well as some new free school bids that have been put in place. So in regards to the SEND Capital Expansion Grant, and I must stress, whilst we recognise that this is great to further develop and build on capacity, actually the onus of the SEND reforms of 2014 was to ensure children and young people, our most vulnerable residents, have access to mainstream provision. So an education, health and care plan doesn't then equate to accessing a specialist setting. You know, the onus is on mainstream schools to make sure they can break down those barriers. But we recognise that there is a lack of specialist provision within the borough, hence the capital expansion plans that we've currently got in place. So I'll talk you through some of the developments that are currently in the process of being developed, either in embryonic stage or actually physically being built as we speak. We have the Hedgewood School, which is an expansion of 25 places, and there's an anticipation that will be ready by September 2020. We have an increase of 30 places at Uxbridge College, and that's for post-16 provision with children or young people with SEND. We have an increase of 10 places at Moorcroft School. We have 2 resource-based provision settings at Ruislip High School, one accommodating children and young people with ASD and another for physical disabilities. And the last part of the SEND Capital Expansion Programme is to be developing a secondary hub, which essentially means that the host school, which would be Meadow School, using 2 different sites to place 30 children in each setting to further increase the sufficiencies we have. Away from the SEND Capital Expansion Programme, we also have Eden Academy Trust, who have applied to develop a free school, and that would be for the creation of a school in the Grand Union Village site for 80 primary places, aged between 3 and 11, for children with SLD and PMLD, so again for severe learning difficulties and profound and multiple learning difficulties. And also the creation of Pin River School, which would provide 180 all-age places for the same type of need. Sitting with that would be the closure of current school, which is Grangerwood Primary School, which currently consists of 113 primary children. The second part of the report is in regards to the support we have for mainstream schools. I think that was one of the questions that were raised previously, so I'm happy to pick that up. And what I'd start by saying is we are a newly transformed service. So we were put together over the summer months, and from September 2019, we rolled out our new strategy and our vision. And part of that is how we can develop a 3-tiered approach to meeting the needs of children and young people with SEND through what we have now is a newly devised SEND advisory service, which is a multidisciplinary pre-statutory service, which I'm absolutely excited about because not many local authorities have that asset. And what we're saying is we want to develop in an early intervention model that will meet the needs of children and young people at a much earlier stage, as opposed to the process of an education, health and care needs assessment. The second part of that service is the educational psychology service, which not only meets the needs of statutory function, so for instance, we'll produce reports and recommendations for EHC needs assessments, but has also started to trade with schools and to work with schools much better than it had previously. And the third function of the service is the statutory work, and that's the work which is, consistently, in the headlines, and that's about children and young people with education, health and care plans, and having officers support casework. So this is underpinned by a new operating model across the area, and as I mentioned previously, it will provide a tiered pathway for support within the local authority, and that will start at a non-statutory My Support plan, which will progress to extra support funding for those children and young people that need further support, and then through the process of an education, health and care plan. And in its entirety, we're talking about a pathway that then reinforces the requirement for a graduated approach supporting all children and young people with SEND in Hillingdon. So that's a whistle-stop tour of this paper. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Vikram, and welcome to Hillingdon Council.
Thank you.
Started. So I'll start with Councillor Markham.
Thank you. I've got two questions, really. Can we see a copy of the strategy?
Yeah. So the SEND. So there are two things at the moment. There's a SEND strategy, which I believe is up until 2021, which would have been ratified, I believe, in 2016 or 17. So I'll happily share that. The second strategy that sits underneath that is the additional needs strategy, which outlines some of the SEND capital provision work. And again, I'm absolutely happy to share that with members.
I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. But I noticed that it's sort of a £5 million budget, and we have 150 children that we're looking after, which by my reckon is roughly 35 grand a year per child. How do you assess that we're getting value for money?
I wouldn't use those figures. I would actually use the figure of around 2,400 children and young people with education, health and care plans in the borough. And so that's the quantum that we're looking at, although we're talking about these cases in particular. But the full quantum of children and young people with an education, health and care plan is coming out at about 2,400 people, children and young people in Hillingdon, which is considerable. And I think anecdotally, part of that is we should be seeing a lot more children accessing SEN support, which is the first tier of support. And I think my colleague alluded to it, Chris, where I don't believe there's been enough trust in the system to ensure that actually on the ground teaching professionals, SENCOs, teaching assistants, have the tools and the expertise to be supporting some of our children and young people at SEN support level, which has then meant a drive in the increase of requests for assessments. So that's part of the challenge that we're really trying to unpick. And part of the SEND advisory service, which is the newly formed multidisciplinary pre-statutory service, will be directly responsible for supporting those settings and having SENCO network forums to ensure that best practice is shared between practitioners, but also to ensure that there is a robustness and challenge in some of the stuff that is coming through to statutory assessment. The figure of 5 million, how that compares both regionally and through our statistical neighbours, is pretty relative, and it's based on growth. So where I was previously, it was less than £5 million. So the figure and the quantum has been worked out based on the needs that we deem to have seen since the 2014 reforms. An interesting point about value for money, because actually I think both locally and nationally we haven't been at a point where we can really assess a value for money because of the supply and demand for children and young people with SEND. And that was picked up certainly at the Education Select Committee review and the findings that have just come out of that, where there hasn't been enough focus on actually what are we getting for the money. Just to put that into practice, we spend £10,000 per place on a special school or in a resource space, on top of top-up funding for individual children. And I don't think, either nationally nor locally, are we at the point where we're assessing how good those outcomes are yet. So clearly the next thing that we need to be doing as part of our service is holding settings to account and making sure that actually we want the best outcomes for our children and young people. And a brief discussion I've had with Chris and with Dan was that we need to do that, and we need to tie into our education colleagues to do so. Otherwise, SEND will always be deemed as a bolt-on, and it's not. So it's our moral imperative to ensure that we're meeting the needs of our most vulnerable, but also we want the best outcomes for these children and young people.
Thank you. Councillor Egginton.
Remember this time. Thank you, Chair. One of the big problems, I think, is financing high needs. as Dan and probably a lot of the people around the table know, there are significant problems with regard to central government financing for high needs. I think in the current year, mainstream schools are having to support high needs to the extent of £3.5 million. Next year, the thought is that it's going to be maybe 6 million, I think, that sort of figure. And despite that, the deficit on the DSG fund is increasing. I think that leads on to the problem for many schools in that unless the child has an education and healthcare plan, then there's relatively little funding, and often at a lower level the support isn't financially possible from a school, particularly small schools, and particularly schools which might have not high levels of SEND children, but nevertheless significant amounts. And all of this, with the way that things, maybe everything will change after the election and there will be lots of funding, but I don't think we can count on that at the moment, whichever way, because unfortunately high needs, special educational needs funding is not a high priority, as has been demonstrated. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on how that can be addressed in Hillingdon.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I'd start by mentioning that actually in Hillingdon we have some pretty unique ways to support schools, whilst it may not seem that we are. So for instance, if I can talk you through an example, we provide a 2% uplift for some schools that take a certain threshold of or percentage of children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. Now, that's relatively unheard of in other local authorities. So whilst I fully appreciate schools' positions, there's a national funding formula which is in the process of being finalised, and there is uncertainty about funding from a school's perspective. Actually, there are things that we are doing within this local authority that are incredibly positive to make sure that the needs of children and young people are supported. Away from the 2% uplift, we are also, and I alluded to it earlier, in the process of developing a pathway to allow schools to access extra support funding, and that would be for those children and young people that do have a degree of additional needs that is deemed to be further than the work one would do in terms of quality first teaching. And through a graduated approach, schools would be able to approach us to gain some further support financially to support the needs of those lower emerging needs for those children and young people prior to the 20-week assessment for an education, health and care plan, which again, there are only at the moment a handful of local authorities that are implementing that. And what's interesting to that, actually, there are other local authorities that I've spoken to who have devised similar sort of tactics to reduce the quantum in terms of education, health and care needs assessments. So for instance, I won't name the authority, but an authority have increased their notional funding. So the notional level of funding is £6,000 per child, and schools are expected to demonstrate, in theory, what they've done after £6,000 to support the process of a needs assessment. Now, I know one local authority that's increased that notional amount to £11,000. So as actually pumped primed into schools to say you have £11,000 to work with. And one of my questions was, well, I would assume then we're seeing a decrease in the number of assessments. Absolutely not the case. There's still an increase. So developing extra support funding and on my support plan not only is going to provide schools with additional support, but also under a framework. And I think that's the key bit of information there, is that we're not just chucking money at schools because that won't fix the problem. But what we're doing is getting to a point where there is some robustness and some governance in the decision-making process that we have, and also allowing for schools to access funding that they wouldn't have been able to previously without an education, health and care plan.
Matthew, do you wish to follow up?
Yes, it's somewhat related to that. There's mention here in the report on page 3 of agenda item B, related to Meadow School and the problems with the temporary classrooms. Am I right in thinking that there's a significant number of children who might, or young people, who might be affected by that it is possibly even 100? I don't know.
So Dan and I met with Jenny Rigby, the head of Meadow, a couple of weeks ago to discuss some of the options. And at that moment, that's where we are. We're looking at some options to ensure that any children that could potentially be at risk, not in the immediate term, but in the long term, to make sure that that issue is remedied and there is an alternative solution found. So there are options currently being considered, and we will present that once we have something.
Thank you. Mr. Little.
Thank you. You talk about this new strategy of having this early stage support that you're introducing. Is there strong evidence that this approach is effective? And is it the expectation that this approach will reduce the number of later plans that are required? And if so, on what sort of ambition are you working?
I wouldn't want to put a figure on the number of plans that we would hope to reduce to, because I don't think at this moment in time I'm confident on the data at the moment to provide you with a figure. But what I would say is this is dependent on developing trust and belief in the system. And for us to do that, similar to what my colleague Chris has said, it's about ensuring that schools understand how to access those services, but also that there is value for money in the services that we're providing. So could you repeat the first bit of that question? Sorry.
The first part of the question was about the evidence on which this new approach is being developed. Is it strong evidence? Is it from other people who've tried it before and so on?
So I think there's two bits to that. There's the initial bit is we've looked at a handful of local authorities who have already started to implement that, and to see that actually that first level of support is working positively. The second bit, and to cite a previous question, we see a number of requests for assessments that come through at SEND panel, and a substantive amount of those requests are for a tier of support that we should be able to provide earlier. So if we can get that support in earlier, we're not talking about the highly complex PMLD provision, but provision which would entail additional support, but doesn't need to go through the mechanism of a 20-week assessment, because we know both locally and nationally there are significant challenges with completing assessments within the 20-week period at the moment, and drawing on our external colleagues.
Mr. Little, do you wish to follow up?
Not at the moment.
Councillor Tuckwell.
Thank you, Chairman. The third point in relation to the plan, which is the casework team. It says here that it's been restructured and enhanced. What kind of training and development has gone into the people working in that team to support that?
Really valid point. So I would say at the moment, in terms of the statutory team, we still have a mixture of agency staff as well as established full-time members of staff, and we are still recruiting. And again, it's not a Hillingdon problem; it's a problem that seems to be spread, nationally. So in terms of recruitment, we're making sure that we're exploring other recruitment avenues. So using much more kind of responsive ways to engage with people, for instance, through the likes of LinkedIn and working with companies to get good caliber staff. The second point in terms of CPT and development, I'm pleased to report I've got 3 direct reports who have newly started as well over the last month, and for the statutory service in particular, there are fortnightly meetings that are in place. There's a development of a CPD program and some upskilling for both existing and for new staff, which is intrinsic to making sure that we operate in the way that we should be. I think married with that, so it's not just about the CPD, but it's also about processes and following a framework. And so what's happened over the last 18 months in particular is that we have had an influx of agency staff that have come in and supported, and that's been great. But without a framework, sometimes some of the challenges, I'm picking some of the issues where staff have used best endeavour, but without that framework haven't followed a process. So the CPD is one aspect, but the second bit is about ensuring there is a validity to the framework that all officers are using. Just a point to note, and I do it on most evenings, is just looking around LinkedIn and seeing what other local authorities are doing. And there's a local authority currently that have introduced a coffee morning for professionals, where they have their SEND officers there to talk to them about a potential career change. And that's the state of play that we're currently in at the moment, in terms of getting the right candidates in through the door.
Councillor Tugwell?
Yeah, just to follow up to that, when do you think you'll have your sort of ducks in a row for this, for want of a better expression, and settled and ready to deliver your plan?
Well, I've communicated to the wider team that I would expect by January we're fully up and running. We have a full service away day on the 22nd of November where all three areas will meet together. A bit of team building, but as well as that, a clear understanding of what that strategy and vision looks like. I must stress that the importance of having these three areas together is to supply residents with a tell us once approach, so they're not having to tell us, through the process of SEN support or an ASD advisor or an early years advisor, and then later on down the line they have to then repeat that information. So what's been clear over the last 2 weeks or so is a willingness and an appetite from internal officers, but naturally they want to see how their role impacts on the wider strategy. So getting the team together on the 22nd will be really, really important. And the communications that I've sent out to the wider team is that by the beginning of January we should be in a place where we've got posts filled, we've got a framework and a structure, we've got governance at the SEND panel, so there's decision-making processes that are taking place with a level of transparency and equity, and part of that will bringing head teachers on board so they understand the decision-making process. But so to answer your question, by January, I would expect.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any members who have not yet asked a question and wish to do so? Nope, in which case I will go back to the original people. Councillor Markham?
We've got 2,500 pupils, students, youngsters we're looking after at the moment. How many will we be looking after in, say, 3 or 4 years' time? Because you must be looking at projections. I mean, you can see, presumably, how many disabled babies there are. I mean, I'm probably not using the right PC language, but
what does
so
forecast,
just wonder, what your projections are.
So it's slightly more complex than traditional school-based planning because of the very nature of SEND, and it relies on diagnosis or over-diagnosis in some instances as well as part of and the SEND reform. So if I can take you to where I was only a few weeks back, which was just around the corner in Slough, we saw a 105% increase in needs assessments over the 4 years of reform. And we're looking at a similar sort of rate of growth. So part of having the SEND advisory service is to ensure that we're able to meet need at the earliest opportunity, which in theory will mean that we won't have as many children accessing a level of needs assessment, not because we're trying to stop it, but because we're providing support at the earliest opportunity. And we know, and it's evidence-based, if we can put support in at the earliest opportunity, it mitigates further risk of needs evolving and developing into something that is harder to contain and to meet.
No, just so 3 or 4 years' time, we may have 5,000 that we're looking after.
Yeah.
Are you confident that the budget will keep pace with that?
Well, the budget at the moment isn't keeping pace with the growth. It absolutely isn't. So the high needs block within the DSG is overspent, and it's based on, it's a multifaceted answer in terms of why we are where we are, and some of it is getting our ducks in a row and making sure that we've got robust governance in some of the decision-making processes that are taking place, but others are about external factors that we can't control in this room, but we can certainly work towards, and developing a structure that enables early intervention will help mitigate this rapid rise and this increase in needs assessments. So at this moment, as we've just launched this service, I think it's quite hard to put a quantum to it, but clearly as part of the strategy and part of my KPIs is monitoring the number of requests that are coming through. What I would say is SEND panel is where all the decisions are made. SEND panel takes place weekly. That's in regards to a new assessment, a change of placement, the level of funding for a child or a young person with an education health and care plan. So essentially every decision that is made at source is at that SEND panel. And part of what we need to do is ensure that there is a level of governance there, so we're able to effectively monitor the needs that are coming through and ensure that we are remedying some of the challenges with extra support funding.
So you're quietly confident that none of the children will suffer in 3 or 4 years' time because there won't be the money, the funding available? I mean, what worries me is that the level of care will go down to meet the budget.
I mean,
the level of care in the budget aren't linked. Our moral imperative is to ensure we're meeting the needs of our residents and our children and young people. What I would say in terms of rate of growth, hopefully the paper outlines some of the provision that we're developing. So there's a lot of capital development that's happening to make sure we can meet growth locally. So I'm confident that we will have provision there, and that will further be explored as we look at additional resource bases that we have within the borough. But this isn't a cost-cutting measure, so we're unable to meet the needs of our children and our young people.
I mean, just to add to what Vikram said, I think it's in terms of very broad terms, it's about creating extra school places in mainstream school, as well as additional needs provision and specialist provision. And so by building the capacity of existing mainstream schools to be able to manage some of the challenges, some of the behaviours, and it's something and it's actually part of the capital plan is specialist resource provision within mainstream schools. So you have a small number of specialist places with support through, in terms of one part of the model is around a satellite hub from a specialist school, which enables actually a wider number of places to be distributed throughout the education system. So, but it's not, this isn't an exact science by any means, and I think there are some important, I suppose, demographic changes that it's not just the volume, it's also the diversity and complexity of need that's changing as well. So it's certainly one that we don't quite have all the answers to, but we're certainly working fast to try to put in place what's needed.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Little.
I'd like to return to the capital programme for a moment. The impression created in the report is that the government has made a sum available, and we've gone out and developed a set of projects that will absorb that capital. Is that a right impression to have, is the first part of the question. And the second one is, are we developing a longer term capital programme for this area of education need?
So in order to access the funding for the same capital expansion grant, you had to consult with wider stakeholders. So there's been a level of consultation that's taken place to get to a point where we are looking at the options that were presented in the paper. And that will form part of a longer term strategy to meet needs within Hillingdon. And just as an example is the creation of 2 hubs. So having our specialist setting, Meadow, offsetting some of their provision in 2 separate hubs will certainly ensure that we're meeting the needs of complex children still maintained within the local authority. And that is a piece of longer term strategic thinking.
Mr. Little.
Did the consultation include the out-of-borough providers that we currently use?
No, so the consultation would have gone to wider stakeholders within the authority, so including schools within the authority, parent carers, and wider professionals, so social care, healthcare professionals, but not out-of-borough schools. They would have had similar sorts of consultation. Every local authority has been provided a grant for capital, so they would have had their respective consultation.
Thank you, and thank you, Vikram, for your report this evening.
Thank you.
Very much appreciated. Returning to our main agenda is item 8, the Cabinet Forward Plan. Are there any questions or comments at all? Councillor Egginton?
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Can you put your mic on, please?
Thank you.
You'll get ready yet.
Done it once out of 4 times, I think. Yes, I understood that there was the Cabinet was going to be considering changes to youth services, and that was the reason why, the reason given why there wasn't a report or major review into that subject on youth services, and I wondered whether that any progress had been made.
That's not quite the issue there, Councillor. The committee requested or proposed as many as on. Sorry, I might get my words in order. The committee suggested a review on youth services as part of several different options. The reason it didn't go forward is that there was officer work in the background on that subject, and it wouldn't be appropriate to progress a review at that same time. But it wasn't necessarily to do with a report or an item for determination by Cabinet. That's my understanding.
Any other questions? No, in which case we can note that. Item 9 is the work programme. Again, Councillor Markham.
Are we going to include the report that we were talking about a bit earlier? The strategy reports we were talking about. They can be included in the works on the agenda?
Yes, I've already made a note of that, Councillor, so with Dan, we'll make sure that comes to January. And if I may, Chairman, just there was another item which at the previous committee it was requested that the Council's position regarding place for December 2020 be brought to the January committee meeting. I'm pleased that has also been scheduled for January.
Thank you very much. With there being any other questions or comments? Councillor Dillon, you're looking at me very...
No, I'm hungry.
Oh, you're hungry? Okay. I can't help you on that one, I'm afraid, sir, but maybe a bit sooner rather than later. So that concludes our business for this evening. Thank you very much for your attendance. Enjoy your meal, Councillor Dillon. Good night.